Hello, and welcome to The Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. For this week's episode, I spoke to Mona Hajjar Halaby, a Palestinian American writer whose memoir, In My Mother's Footsteps, sheds light on the heartbreaking realities for millions of Palestinian refugees. Her mother fled Palestine during the 1948 war to Egypt, where Mona was born and raised until the 60s, when they were forced to leave. Mona spent a year later in life working in Ramallah, Palestine, as a teacher, where she also traced her mother's footsteps and visited her ancestral home. It's a poignant story of returning home, understanding one's Palestinian identity, and searching for new homes as refugees. Mona Hajjar Halaby is a Palestinian American educator, writer, and social historian. In order to preserve Palestinian culture and heritage, she has created British Mandate Jerusalemites Photo Library on Facebook and the Palestine Ethnographic Society. She collaborated on an interactive documentary called Jerusalem We Are Here, which takes participants on a walking tour of a neighborhood in Jerusalem, past and present, and presents a map that documents the houses in the neighborhood with their documents, photos, and stories. Mona has written a parenting book, a book on her classroom practice, and In My Mother's Footsteps, a Palestinian refugee returns home, is her latest book, and it is a memoir. Hello, Mona. Thank you so much for joining me on the Diverse Bookshelf today. It is an absolute pleasure to have you. How are you?
Fine, thank you. And thank you for hosting me. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you today.
So obviously you've written a memoir, In My Mother's Footsteps, and I kind of feel like it's a multitude of stories or like different, you tell your mother's story, you tell your own story. And I've interviewed quite a lot of authors, but I think this is the first time that I'm going to be speaking to somebody basically about their entire life. So I am really excited, but I feel like there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to really get to the heart at. And so, I'm really glad that you're here today. And I'm really honored that you're willing to share so much of your life and yourself with us. So please, to begin with, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself? Just introduce yourself and your family.
Yes, well, I am a Palestinian American living in California in the US. I grew up as the daughter of a Palestinian refugee in Alexandria, Egypt. And then when President Nasser nationalized Egypt in 1961, we became political refugees and lost our home. So my mother lost her home twice, once in Palestine in 48 and then in 61 in Egypt. But for my father, my sister, and myself, it was our first loss of home. And we were lucky enough to end up in Geneva, Switzerland, where my dad worked there for an international multinational company. So I grew up in Switzerland, and then I came to study at UC Berkeley and met my husband, my future husband. And we got married, and I have been in the United States now for 50 years. That ages me, but anyway, so that's I became an educator. I was in graduate school getting a PhD in you won't believe this, in medieval literature. I was a medievalist. My languages in comparative literature were Latin, Old French, and Old English.
Oh, wow.
And then we wanted to start a family, and we had our first child. And then I fell in love with being a mother and also watching the development of my child. I became curious about child development, decided to throw out the PhD program, and went and got early childhood education certification and a credential for elementary school teaching. And I became an elementary school teacher. I had two more children, so I have three sons. And I taught for 30 years. And during that time, I wrote, two other books. One was a parenting book, which I co-authored, No Fault Parenting. And another one was belonging, creating community in the classroom, because my specialty in education is how to help children resolve conflicts, which is prevalent in my book, In My Mother's Footsteps. And then when I retired in the summer of 2018, I was so excited because now I could really focus on writing, because writing has always been a passion. And I had to, juggle it with teaching, which is very hard. But
Mm.
I've been writing full time since my retirement. That's a little bit about my life.
That's great. I mean, it sounds incredible. You've done some absolutely amazing things, and you continue to do today as well. And yeah, and obviously you come from a family that has experienced conflict and war, forced displacement, and your mother was a refugee. You yourself also were a refugee, and I just want to talk a little bit about what that what that meant for you, because the refugee crisis at the moment is one of the worst crises that we are facing. Like, it is just unprecedented. Like, the numbers are so huge that I don't think we can actually comprehend exactly how many people have been displaced from their homes due to war or conflict. And people are doing unthinkable things in order just to survive and try to find safety. And I think what your book really does is it gives us a human story to understand some of the challenges and some of the heartbreak and some of the issues that refugees face. But I wondered if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Of course, I will. Yes, you're right. The numbers are staggering. I think it's 89.1 million displaced
Mm.
people in the world right now. I have to preface this by saying that I had the privilege of being able to recover from refugeehood, and that many people are languishing in refugee camps, and that is something I live with, the sort of the survivor guilt. My family did not have the means because we lost everything, but we had the connections, we had the education, we had the languages. Those things helped us sort of recover out of Egypt, and my mother out of Palestine. When I think about my own childhood, I think that my parents' love was the constant. And this is what helped me as a child, to recover. I was 11 years old. And actually, I finished a memoir about becoming a refugee in Egypt, and I'm looking for a publisher. So if you know of a publisher, let me know. I think that the constant in my life and my sister's life was this the solidness of our loving parents, which helped us, adjust. But I'm not going to also belittle the fact that I was, and I still am, a strong person, a strong woman. When I reread my journals from that period of my life, because I started writing a daily diary journal since I was 13. And when I reread the, how I coped with my, hardships, or with my struggles with my girlfriends at school and so on, I, I see the kernel of the woman that I am today. I stood up for myself. I stood up for others. I went on marches. So the activist in me, the good friend in me, the big sister in me, all of those things I can see are still there. And I think that is a testament to, the fact that I had a loving home, that I had a very strong mother with whom you got to know through her letters to me in my mother's footsteps. Her strength, her courage, her enthusiasm about life, her, just helped me a great deal. My father was also a very strong, loving man. He's not featured a lot in my mother's footsteps. He's featured more in the book about becoming refugees out of Egypt. But I was lucky, very lucky. I still
Yeah.
count my blessings.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that, so your parents were, or well, your mother fled Palestine in 1948, and that was at the time of the creation of the State of Israel. Then the family moved to Egypt, and then from there, like you've had so much more migration. What has that done to your sense of your own Palestinian identity?
Well, it took a little while for me to figure out my Palestinian identity, even though, of course, my mother's love for Palestine was foremost in her life. Palestine was the word I grew up hearing all the time. But it was an odd combination. I was born in Egypt to a Palestinian mother and a Syrian native who was in Egypt. So my father's family had immigrated to Egypt at the turn of the century. They didn't know each other. They met in Egypt, his mother and father. And when I would ask my father why they left Aleppo, Syria, he never, his parents were not very communicative. They didn't, and he didn't ask. And so it was lost. But I am guessing that they left because of the Christian. My family is Christian Arab, and there was a lot of there were a lot of massacres that happened in Syria and Lebanon in the late 1800s.
Mm.
Both Muslims, I mean Druze, the Druze sect of Islam, and Christians were massacred. And so I think it's sad to say, but like every if I look at my family tree, every branch has persecution, you know, um, displacement, war. And I think it's also because my family's in that little crescent of land that connects the east to the west, to Africa, Asia, and Europe, and that a lot of people move around that area. It was an area that was rich with civilization and history, but also with a great deal of turmoil, which continues to this day between the Palestinians and the Israelis,
Mm.
sadly. So, yeah, growing up with that baggage, of displacement and loss, uh, could very well knock you down. And, but I guess, my spirits have always been towards doing something about it, and I do a lot to help humanitarian causes and my activism. And I feel I don't want to be, how do I explain that? I don't want my anger at what has happened in my life to win over. And it's hard enough to have lost everything, let alone live with the bitterness and anger. And I have seen many, many Palestinians so embittered by what has happened that that's all they talk about, that's all they breathe, that's all they, you know their identity is so connected. Now, my identity as a Palestinian came out of that turmoil, and that, but don't want it to eat me up. I want to also have a positive attitude and not see myself as a victim of
Mm.
circumstances, which a lot of people, we are victims of our situations. Oftentimes it's not by choice that you are displaced, but it's not that I'm Pollyannish or, highly. Well, I'm optimistic and I'm an idealist. Obviously, I was in education. If you're a teacher, you are an idealist because you believe in something in the future. And so then I married a man who was also sharing the same background. He was born in Jerusalem. He also lost his home. And so my Palestinian identity from my mother and then my husband they just got consolidated, especially that my dad did not speak much about his Syrian roots, and then because he didn't know much about it, and then he was first generation born in Egypt, and he didn't really identify with Egypt, so he ended up identifying with Switzerland as an Arab, basically general Arab label, and has lived the rest of his life until his death a few years ago in Geneva.
I think what really comes out in your book is that, I guess, part of your Palestinian identity was kept alive by storytelling and by your mother, talking about growing up in Palestine, in Jerusalem, and about your family and various traditions and stuff. I just wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because I feel like that was like a big part.
Yes, my mother was an amazing storyteller, and not only stories about her childhood, but about people her family knew, um, relatives, distant relatives. I mean, everybody. She sort of encapsulated Palestine for me, And then, of course, her cooking, which was Palestinian, delicious food. And you know how, we all connect deeply to food because it is part of sort of our identity. The songs she used to sing, and also the proverbs. My mother had tons and tons of proverbs available to her. And when sadly she developed dementia and started to lose her memory, oftentimes instead of saying the actual a sentence to explain something, she'd say it in a proverb, because the proverbs were so deeply rooted. And I remember sitting by her side and typing in every proverb she would say, and so I have, over 100 proverbs on my laptop. So she did bring the joy of Palestine and the sadness of Palestine all in one, encapsulated all in one. Um, you know, but she was reluctant to go back and see it, as I wrote in the book. It was very, very, very hard for her to accept going. It took 51 years, but she kept it alive, and she connected with people everywhere she went. She was like a magnet, in a living room. You knew where my mother was because that's where everybody was. She was able to, because of her charisma and her joyfulness, she attracted people. They loved being around her, and she would tell them, "I'm a Palestinian, I'm from Jerusalem." Yeah. And people, she was a great ambassador, and people loved her for that.
Yeah. She's just through the book, like, I feel like I know her and I met her. Like, she just sounds absolutely incredible. And you spoke just a bit earlier as well about not, like, how you don't want that anger, or like, you don't want the anger to win, essentially. You don't want to feel so much resentment that it takes over from goodness and joy and kindness and empathy. And I think, like, that is a real part of the human experience, that you can experience more than one feeling at any one given time. You can experience feelings that are internal and not act on them. And actually what came out a lot in the book as well was just this inner turmoil that you experienced when you were in Palestine and when you were trying to go back to your family home, especially when it came to interacting and communicating with some Israelis who, there was times where they were kind of, giving you permission to access certain areas, or they were asking you who you are and about your identity and your roots. And you, like, it really stands out to me in the book that you said, you work with children, teaching them how to communicate and how they're feeling and what's going on, and to communicate their truth. But in your situation, when you're trying to go home and you're going through Palestine and you're having to interact with Israeli authorities, that you're unable to speak your own truth.
Yes.
I wondered if you could just give more words to that experience. If you could just tell us a little bit about what happened, and really how you dealt with that inner turmoil.
Yes, it was very challenging for me to apply what I used in the classroom with children to my search for my home or my interactions with Israelis. And I think some of it is because I was not able to, in circumstances that were totally um, you know, unpredictable. I did not have a chance to have the other be in relationship with me to form those guidelines of how are we going to communicate about this topic? How can we
Mm.
be respectful? How can we listen with care and kindness? How can we have compassion for the other? um, which are sort of the elements of my nonviolent communication methods that I use with children. And for instance, when I walked in my mother's neighborhood looking for a house, and I ran into this Eastern European Israeli woman who said, go away, you don't belong here," something to that effect. And I was just like so taken aback. I did not expect somebody to say that to me. And the shock of it was almost made me almost, mute, because it's interesting how when you're so taken aback by somebody's anger and the violence of their anger, you could strike back, and but I don't believe in striking back. I mean, I could have maybe said something with force, but I was so unprepared for it that I
Mm.
experienced then the loss my mother felt. It was like my Nakba all of a sudden. I was in her shoes, being expulsed from my homeland. Now, this woman had nothing to do with my mother's home. She was somebody who lived in the neighborhood, but she had seen me there several times, and felt threatened by me. So yeah, it it was hard for me to even with somebody, an Israeli woman who helped me a great deal, find locations. She's an archivist and a photographer. Even with her, there were limits to our conversation. There were limits that I felt. I struggled. I thought, how can I be a little more direct with her? But so much of my talent in the classroom with my students, I could not apply in real life with, well, real life with my students. It's real life too, but in my own interactions with Israelis. And I think these were the limitations of my situation. I don't regret it. There's no other way I could have done it, and that's the way
Mm.
I managed. I needed to survive. I was there on a special 1 year visa. I did not want to make any trouble and be sent back. Which could happen. It has happened to people I know. I did not want to be taken, interrogated. And I wanted to leave the door open to return someday if I wanted to. Now, of course, with my book in my mother's footsteps, I don't know whether I'll be allowed if I wanted to return. But, you know, I did the best I could.
Hmm. And on actually returning home, so obviously this is like the undercurrent theme in the book is like a journey towards returning home, returning back to Jerusalem. In your life, like you've had so much migration, some forced but some voluntary. And I felt like reading it, and I think this generally about life as well, is that when we are moving so much, we're constantly looking for somewhere to call home, whether we're able to make the place that we're currently home or not, but we're currently in search of something that feels like home, whether that means that it's safe or it's comfortable or it's linked to our family, linked to our ancestry, whether it's we have a connection to the soil, like whatever it is, like we all have this internal idea of what home is. And I think it means different things to different people.
Right.
But do you think that for Palestinian refugees, even those that are able to travel back to see where they used to live before they were forced to leave, do you think that we're ever able to really go back home?
No, I don't think you really go back home because over the years, home, the reality of your home has changed, um, as well as your own concept of home changes because you've been in a different environment in a different country. I mean, here I am 50 years in the United States. I feel I'm at home here as well. I don't deny my roots. I don't, give up being a I never say I'm American. I'm a Palestinian American. But I think that when my mother, was in the airplane as it hovered over the Tel Aviv airport, and she looked down, and I could tell she wasn't too happy with what she saw. And then on the bus, when we were driving the shuttle bus from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and she said, "I don't recognize this country," and she added, "I'm glad I don't, because then I don't feel like I'm missing my homeland." She had her homeland in her mind, and it wasn't
Mm.
what she was visibly exposed to. So I think home, for me anyway, it's not so much a piece of land and a house, and it's your community. It's the people, that give meaning to your life. It's the work that you do. It's the love you have. Of course, if there was peace and Palestinians could return, I would love to be able to go there. But I can't imagine myself, living there permanently. Um, my children and grandchildren live here, and I want to be close to them. But having lived 1 year there gave me a sense of what life is like there, and I loved it, and I could imagine myself living there. When I came back, I missed it a lot.
Mm.
So home, what is home? It's what you carry on your back and in your heart. We're like little snails. We have our little home attached to us. And it's in my heart. I will I will always feel a Jerusalemite in my heart.
Mm. I think one of the hardest things to witness on social media, especially in recent years, has been the footage coming out of Gaza and the West Bank of people being expelled from their homes because it's so violent, it's so uncomfortable, it's so horrific and unjust. And I feel that part of it is because like our home and our ideas of home is just so fundamental to who we are and like our existence. Like what on earth do you do if you're forced out of your home? Like what, like I just, it's just so mind boggling to think like, well, what would happen? It just feels like everything kind of falls away. And you also talk about this in the book, how through your mother's letters, that what comes, and also I guess from her stories, like what comes across is her love for Jerusalem, but also the loss of Jerusalem.
Yes.
And that, and I feel like for refugees especially, like every time you move there's just loss after loss after loss, and in pursuit of safety and in pursuit of home.
Yeah,
Yeah, I just think it's so important to understand the depths of that, in order to really think about what we can do in the world to support those that are displaced, instead of developing right wing ideologies and closing the borders. Like,
exactly.
if we're not able to connect with really what happens and what that level of loss is, I just think it's such a huge shame.
I know. May I add something to what you're saying? the trauma of the loss of home is with you for your whole life. I lived it because of my mother's trauma, but then my own, losing my childhood home. I live in a part of California that is often threatened by fires in the last few years because of climate change. And my in the fall, we start getting these messages from our councilwoman, our the police department, the fire department, saying, prepare to evacuate, and the sense that I need to put somewhere in boxes the things that I cherish the most because my home could burn down. um, think about your evacuation route, and all of those things, they bring about such a reaction. I become
Mm.
extremely anxious because it's reviving all of that, having to leave your home, and your home may be lost forever, and you're forcibly displaced, but it's for your own safety, right? It's not because somebody wants to come and move into your house, but it's still that same trigger for
Mm.
loss.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it must be really, even in that case, like really scary because you don't know if you're gonna have a home to go back to, because if you lose the home in the fire, like you just don't know.
Yeah,
And I think that's what fuels, I think, just so much of the struggle is just the uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. And
yeah,
actually, you write in the book that part of your survival is to make yourself forget things. And I just thought that that was so like eloquent and really poetic as well. But that actually that the act of forgetting is definitely a tool of survival and maybe even a tool of resistance in some way as well. Because if you are living in the same kind of turmoil and stress and pain that for example that your mother experienced in 1948 when she was forced to leave, if she lived in that same state every single day, how on earth do you survive? Like there's no
yeah.
survival. Yeah.
And she wouldn't have been able to give my sister and me the joy of life. I mean, life is so short. We're on this planet for such a short amount of time. And if you're going to live with the trauma facing you every day, I think that you will lose out on some beautiful things that can happen to you. So yeah, I don't say I forget exactly everything that's happened to my family, but to survive, you need to live in a little bit of denial and keep on going.
Yeah, because I think there's such a there's almost like a fine line or like a I don't know, like a boundary or something that comes down to it. Because on the one hand, I guess if you don't face your past, if you don't acknowledge it, you don't give yourself time to heal from it, and then it resurfaces in really unpredictable ways, and that influences the next generation and then the generation after that. We have all this, and this is where the intergenerational trauma comes from as well, is when you're not able to nip it in the bud. But also, like, because I worked in the charity sector, like I've met many people that have just said in times of crises especially, like we can't think about the fact that we are suffering, like we have to focus on our survival. And then I guess the longer that you have to do that, the more detached you become from the thing itself, which must massively impact your ability to heal from it and to process it. And maybe there's like a like a forced forgetting that's just like I just can't engage with it because it's too far gone, it's going to set me back, I'm not going to be able to survive. Yeah. And I just that was really profound.
There's a lot of pain in facing it, and so you need to put it aside. I think in the book I said it's like looking at the sun. You can't look at it straight all the
Yeah.
time. You damage your rods. You have to protect yourself on some level. But you're absolutely right. You have to also have a safe place to talk about the trauma, and work through it so that you can, stand on your feet and feel like you can manage in the world. I worry about, recently in Sudan, all the refugees, before that, Afghanistan, Syria, you know, do they get access to mental health care? I know Children Without Doctors Without Borders offers a mental health component, and I hope they are going into the refugee camps and helping uh, adults, but children as well. But adults, I think it's more important at this point, because I'm thinking, if my mother did not have the ability to love me and give to me, I would not have been able to give to my own children and continue on to find joy in life. So I think if the adults who have lived through trauma can get help and support, the next generation will be um, happier
Yeah,
for it.
absolutely. And I think one of the hardest things really for a lot of refugee communities or immigrant communities in general is actually when they come to like a quote unquote safe place, whether it's the UK or whether it's Germany or whether it's Egypt, what they tend to face is resistance and othering and racism and those, a different form of attack and a different form of, persecution or just having to try and survive. And I think when you're
Right.
already dealing with the trauma of war, to then come and deal with racism on top of that, like how you now have two different sets of traumas that you're trying to deal with, and then you're trying to heal from. Even if you deal with one, the other one is still a very real issue. Like, where do we go from there? It
Yeah.
just feels like a compounding issue that requires so much, well, not even so much, but it requires empathy and kindness. And I think part of the reason why we have so much hostility is because foreign policy is driven by this othering agenda and like almost like a, I don't know, like a campaign anti foreigners and, anti immigrant, which is really, really harmful, especially to those people that have already experienced so much.
Eurocentric perspective of the world, the, sort of the white supremacy, the white, it really affects every single, human being in the world that is non-white, non-Christian, sad to say, but that's
Mm,
the truth, you know. Maybe people who have less education, are discriminated against. I mean, there's a lot of discrimination, and my family did not live through so much discrimination in that way, although I experienced in Switzerland as a 12-year-old Swiss girl in my class saying to me that I was a dirty Arab. That was a shock, because I had never heard the word dirty and Arab paired
mm,
together. And as far as I remembered the pain of that. The pain of that when I became an adult. I still remembered that she called me that, but I didn't remember how I reacted until I reread my journals of that period. And I'm embarrassed to say, but I wrote that I slapped her across the face when she said that. And I was, what? Me? I'm such a pacifist. But I think there was such an affront to her words that I could not tolerate them. And I went and and that was in front of other kids. And I think that was like, oh boy, you know, don't get, don't say anything like that to Mona, but but it's to say that, you experience something that is discriminatory, that's insulting, that's belittling, from a Swiss girl in my
mm,
classroom. And remember that I could not accept that,
mm.
but I had forgotten that aspect, maybe because I was so embarrassed that I realized that. My son say, "Mom, how could you have done that?" I said, "I'm sorry." It was self-preservation.
Wow.
I'm sure that you've experienced some of that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially there's a lot of like microaggressions these days, just the way that people will assume that I can't speak English, or that I live a certain way, or that like I can't wear hijab, like I'm being forced to wear hijab, or that my husband is really oppressive. Like all of these assumptions, these are everyday microaggressions, and it couldn't be further from the truth. I'm a very strong, independent woman. I studied at Cambridge University. Like, I love to read. Like, it's just so like so far away from.
Yeah, you break stereotypes.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So you spent a year teaching in Palestine, and I wondered if you could tell us about that. Like and it comes in the book as well. There's you almost have this sort of like you can't believe that this opportunity has come up. Like you're just in awe and you're so excited, and you feel like this is it. Like this is the thing that you've been waiting for. But yeah, if you could just talk about what it was, what you did, and like how you felt.
It was you're so right. I was so excited about it. I had been teaching American children how to communicate nonviolently, and this was an opportunity of a lifetime to teach my own people, and to hopefully make an impact, so that maybe the next generation has tools to try and help bring justice and peace. And of course, arriving there and finding a place to live, and missing David, my husband, and having a new life was something so, like being a college student all over again.
Hmm.
And then I realized that I had to be very careful as I entered in into into educating and training the faculty there, because um, I became very concerned about being seen as this Westerner coming from the US, sort of knowing what to do, knowing better what to do. I was very aware that that's not how I wanted to come across. I wanted to learn. But of course, I did have tools that I could teach, and I I was hired to train the faculty at the Ramallah Friend School, a Quaker school, founded by the Quakers, but it's 97% non-Quakers. They're Muslim and Christian students who attend the school. Um, it's a private school, large, 650 students in the elementary segment. That's where I was hired to teach. And so I was training the faculty by doing an apprenticeship model where I did a class meeting to help children resolve conflicts while their teacher and their counselor, school counselor, attended, so that afterwards we could debrief what they saw. And I did that half of the year. And the second half, they did the class meetings and I observed them and gave them feedback. And the principal, the director of the school, had hired me because she was seeing so much conflict, physical conflict in the playground. And you don't expect, I mean, we live a fairly peaceful life here in California, but there's violence, of course, especially gun violence in the United States, which is dreadful every day. But in general, at my school, children did not hit each other. They were trained to talk it over. And the principal was concerned about the children's level of violence towards each other. Also, other things like hyperactivity, inability to focus, um, you know, uh, uh, just the predisposition that made it hard for them to really attend to their studies and to their friendships. So it became clear, because I did a lot of research, reading UNESCO reports, reading about children, in Darfur who were, in war zones or militarized areas. How do they respond to conflict? Well, Palestinian children were not different from any other kids in the world that lived in a militarized zone. I mean, everywhere they go, they see Israeli tanks, soldiers, settlers. I mean, not even soldiers, but settlers with their F-16s slung around their shoulders. So, when you live with that amount of the weapons facing you and seeing conflicts in the street and people hitting each other and so on, you basically absorb it. As a child, this is what this is how you resolve conflicts. The powerful win, the mighty ones win. Plus, they had the component of having parents traumatized by all of that and picking up on their parents' uh, anxiety, because every parent wants to protect their children and make their environment safe. But I think when you're a Palestinian parent, you don't have that privilege. You cannot protect your child because you can't even protect yourself. And so I saw all the traumas in encapsulated within the families, and children were very, very willing to learn new ways to resolve conflicts, and made big headways. And to this day, they're using the same model at the school because the counselor continued to use this model of class meetings. I have an example in the book, a long chapter about a boy who was, quite aggressive and who was manipulating the class and his teachers, including myself. And I found myself in a situation which I had never been, which is to be scared of one of my students, so much so that I could not protect the rest of them. And I learned a lesson and apologized to the class at the end because this was something hard and I was not prepared for it. So there were limitations to the work I could do because of my own inability to understand the dynamics with this student. But he was an exception. I mean, out of 650 kids, I think having one failure is okay. And it wasn't really a failure because we all learned a lot from it. And sadly, this child needed much more help because of his home environment. His home environment was abusive, and I could not write so much about that in the book because I needed to be able to protect the family's privacy. But sadly, they don't have child protective services, and access to mental health care and therapists is not as available, and there's still a stigma attached to it anyway. So, I couldn't really help this boy in the way that I helped other kids. But I think that I did make an impact, and teachers and the director appreciated all the work that I did. And for me, it was a fantastic learning experience.
Yeah, I think it's like, kind of universally acknowledged that in any kind of, whether it's a war situation or a disaster, that children the among the most vulnerable, and they are the biggest impacted because they are least able to protect themselves. They don't really often have enough of an understanding of what's going on, and also because God willing, they have a long life ahead of them, and it can be impacted by what's going on. But I don't know if we really understand exactly how war can impact children, because I still think that so much narrative around refugee experiences and war is kind of like that when the person arrives and they're granted asylum or whatever it may be, that's kind of like the end of the journey almost, and that's it, kind of they're safe and they're fine and they can rebuild their lives. But in reality, that's sort of the beginning of another whole chapter, another whole book almost. And there's a whole host of issues and challenges and things that are experienced. But I wonder if you could share some some of the key things, and obviously like you do mention it in the book, but some of the key things that you learn with regards to PTSD in children in Palestine. Yeah, and just kind of what you took away from your time there.
Well, I spend one chapter writing about what I saw with PTSD, especially with the fifth graders at the school. So the 10-year-olds at the school, they had very limited ability to put themselves into someone else's shoes. There was a very young, to me, it felt young way, which is without using it in a pejorative sense, a very self centered way of approaching the world. And I, was curious about that because the the 10-year-olds I've worked with in the United States are starting to really understand someone else's point of view. They develop multiple viewpoints on different topics, and also they're able to separate from their parents. In fact, that's what they really want, is to separate from their parents. Whereas the children in the fifth grade that I taught in Palestine were very clingy, especially that grade, because I worked with parents. I offered parenting seminars because I felt I could not do this work in isolation, just in the classroom. I needed to have parents on board to know what we're working on in terms of nonviolent communication, but also to give parents support. And parents were very, very happy to have access to that. And parents who tell me that they couldn't even go downstairs in their apartment building to the mailbox without their 10-year-old panicking.
Mm.
And so uh, I kept thinking, why? Why is that? And then I had a hypothesis, which I shared in the book. And I thought, these children are acting like 5-year-olds. So what happened 5 years ago? Well, 5 years ago was when the Israeli tanks, invaded Ramallah for 32 days. Ramallah was under curfew. It was dreadful for many, many children, tanks in their driveways, Israeli soldiers coming into their house and requisitioning the upstairs and stuffing them in a couple of rooms, if they're lucky, sometimes in just one room, sometimes in a bathroom, so that they could have access to the toilet, but really horrible circumstances. And I thought, wow, were these children, these 10-year-olds, stuck in that space? Can development be, altered or frozen due to trauma and PTSD? And because I'm not a psychologist, but I'm an amateur, psychologist in many ways. When you're a teacher, you have to be. But in I of course I have no way of saying that this is true, but this was a hypothesis. And once I understood that, I developed so much more compassion for these 10-year-olds, because at first I remember feeling like, come on, can't you see your friend is hurt by your insults or whatever? The episode was a girl's picture was, passed around by some boys, and they were making fun of her looks, and they had no ability to have empathy for her. And of course that scares me when someone doesn't have empathy. you know I always worry they're going to become psychopaths down the line. It's there's not that ever that people all do that, but anyway, I felt that if I could have empathy for them and help them by giving them stability, security, um, some of the things that probably they didn't feel at the time of the turmoil, because no adults was feeling, safe. So if the adults around you are not safe, you're not going to feel safe. So I saw that PTSD manifest really strongly
Mm.
through the parents' narratives as well as the children's
Mm.
behaviors. Um, I saw it also. in the streets. There had been a shooting of a 16-year-old who had been a student at our school, at the Ramallah Friends School, who was walking home from school and was shot down by an Israeli tank. And in Palestine, they immediately a little memorial at the site of the shooting, um, is is built by the community, stones and flowers and pictures and so on. And every day, our students, younger students, were walking to school right by that memorial. It's the reality of death that could be unpredictable, that could be violent, that could be not negotiated. You can't talk to a soldier who has a gun aimed at
Mm.
you, and especially not as a child. I mean, there's some trained people in the police force that can do that, but I think that kind of perpetuates, of course, the anguish. And but the reality is, you want to mourn the people you love and you've
Mm.
lost. So, dilemma: do you honor them with a memorial, and but then do your kids suffer from being exposed to it day in, day
Mm.
out? Do they develop defenses and can walk right by it without feeling anything, using your term of forgetting, to be able to survive? Maybe that's what we all do to
Mm.
cope.
See, a lot of people will say, like, oh, it feels like just yesterday that something happened, for example. And they say, like, oh, even though it happened 5 years ago, but if I just think about it, I can really, I can feel it like in my bones. I can feel like it happened just yesterday. And I think part of that is also trauma. And I guess for children, it doesn't feel like it was yesterday. It feels like it's still now, because when you're a child and if something happens all of a sudden, it it can really alter your idea of, well, if it happened then, it can happen anything. We can just be sat at school and all of a sudden we could be raided by Israeli soldiers. Like they just don't have that, and they just don't know. And actually, I mean, to be honest, the situation in Palestine is quite like that. Like, it's so unpredictable. People don't know when things are going to happen. So it's a very real fear, I feel.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Even a pleasurable thing like a field trip,
Mm.
and I thought about that, taking the children to the Jerusalem Zoo was unpredictable. And we were punished by having to stay an hour at the checkpoint, even though we had all of the papers and everything was in order. So, you know, it just, like one of my colleagues said, they just want to take the joy out of
Yeah,
it for us. They want,
yeah,
and there's some element of cruelty, that feels unnecessary. Life is hard enough, don't make it harder. But, so I was able to write about that because, to me, these examples help people understand the Palestinian story. Um, and I think that oftentimes there's some wonderful books out there that are more theoretical, written by professors, and they have value and they need to be on our shelves. I'm not saying they don't, but oftentimes for everyday man and woman, having access to a personal story is something that connects us as human beings. That's what a lot of people have said about my book, is that it helped them understand the political situation through stories about people and everyday
yeah,
life, as well as pointing out the joy, because I didn't want to just write about all of the dreadful things that are happening there. I wanted to showcase them for sure, but I also wanted to talk about the beauty of the landscape, and the food and the hospitality and all of my mother's childhood friends that I went to visit. And because, like I said earlier, you don't want to feel like a victim as a Palestinian all the time. you
yeah,
know I think all people who have experienced loss and displacement want their identity to be multifaceted, not to be just, the Palestinian refugee, the Palestinian victim of Israeli violence, but to be, a human being, a
Mhm.
well-rounded.
Yeah, and I think also to remember that war and occupation, like when they take place anywhere around the world, like life doesn't stop. And I think
That's
in
right.
history, it's kind of like, okay, well, it's this year to this year, and then the war happened in this year to this year, and then this year to this year, everything carried on. But it doesn't. Life doesn't pause. Like people are still trying to feed their families. People are still falling in love and getting married and having babies, and like children are still trying to get an education. The seasons are changing. Like life goes on, but it's happening also while people are scared for their lives because they are being forced out of their homes and they are being attacked and war is happening. But that's also a really important reminder as well. Like, you know, whoever is impacted by war, these are not simply victims of war. These are people that have had a life before, have a life during the war, and will have hopefully a life afterwards that is full of so many different things and is so enriching. And they have family and they have jobs and they have personality, but just gets brought down to population numbers.
Conflict.
Yeah, numbers, statistics.
It's so true. I wish the world, I wish the world would see what refugeehood is like, what one's home. People who haven't experienced it, I don't think can know it. Not just refugee displacement. It's a bigger term, I guess. That stability of home, to come back to that theme. And I think that, for us Palestinians, I think we feel as though the world is silent to our demise, to the aggression that we're experiencing from the state of Israel. And people sometimes ask me, what is your opinion, any solution? I say, I'm not a politician, I'm not a diplomat. I'm a human being. I want people to work these issues together, sit together at the same table and say, okay, what do you need to make it work? What do you need to make it work? The way I resolved conflicts with
Mhm.
children. but but we're very far from that, especially with the more far right government that Israel has at the moment. And so I'm very
Mhm.
scared for my people.
Yeah, I'm very scared for them as well. But we live in hope, and we live with acts of resistance as well. And we hope that we're able to do whatever we can to just put pressure. I think that's the thing. It's about putting pressure, raising awareness, just making as much noise as we can. But I just wanted to, just as we kind of close up, because it's been so wonderful speaking to you, and I also know like we haven't gone into detail about the history or like the various things that have happened over the years. I think your book goes into detail about that, and there are sources that people can find out that information from. But I really wanted to focus on your story today, and I want to hear from you about what was it like the first time you went back to your mother's village. How did you feel?
When I went back to my mother's home in
Jerusalem, yeah.
Jerusalem, oh, yeah, that was when I got to go inside the house, which was sadly after both my mother and my husband passed away. I I just had so many emotions because I was walking in the place where she had grown up, that she had drawn a map for me of every room and every painting on the wall, every potted plant. I mean, it's almost like I knew it, in my heart. Um, it's interesting. Of course, I was not happy that someone else was living in it, but at the same time, I was grateful for so many things. And this is maybe because one of my sort of most important elements. The most important element in my life is gratitude. I always look for ways to thank, my lucky stars for this or that, and so when I went in there and I saw that the people who lived in there, the woman was an Israeli woman from Tunisia, that she had loved the architecture of the house. It was an Ottoman house, that she had kept all of the beautiful arches, so many elements of the house were still there. So that walking in that house felt like it was still my
Mm.
mother's house, even though someone else was living in it, and the paintings were not the same on the wall. But the woman was an artist, and she had a lot of paintings of nature, flowers especially, on the walls. I was sad that I couldn't have brought my mother to it, to walk through. But I was able to walk through, and the last bit that was the most upsetting was that I wish I had that key, my the key to the house, which was hanging behind the door, and which the family used as an artistic, you know, they loved it so much because it was artistic, but they did not know that for me that key was home, and I made a comment about hoping, wishing that I could make a copy of it. I didn't say wish I could have it, but they turned a blind eye or blind ear, a deaf ear to my request or wish. But I held it in my hand, and I knew my mother's hand had been on that key, and that's a symbol of Palestinian return, the key. And so that was, I think, the part that was the hardest for me. But the rest was, my being there meant that I could insert myself into my past,
Mm.
even if my past is not something that I can hold and keep, but being able to get in there. And I'm grateful, again, to bring up that adjective. I'm grateful that they opened the door, but I was with an Israeli man, and that helped me get in. So that this a lot of emotions, Samia, you know joy, sadness, a little bit of anger, but not too
Mm.
much, and a lot of
Yeah.
gratitude.
Do you have, just off the top of your head, do you have any books, any other books that people could read to if they wanted to learn more about Palestine, what's happened and what's happening at the moment?
You mean more theoretical books and academic
Yeah.
books? Well, All That Remains is a good book by Khalidi. There's lots of, like, for instance, The Lemon Tree by Sandy Tolan is an interesting book about that. The not is it Nights in Janine, I think, is the name of the other, a book written by Abul Hawa. Yeah, I'm blanking out on so many books. If you could see my bookshelf, Um, but I think that personal stories will give you, and also fiction, and you're with your diverse bookshelf, you do tackle things also, not just on the memoir, but you also look at fiction. And fiction is a really great tool to bring people into an environment and a place and a time. So there are a lot of great books. I can't think right off the top of my head
Yeah.
right now, but your selection is
Thank
fantastic.
you.
You're doing such a great service, Samia. Really,
Thank
thank
you
you
very
so
much for
much.
that. That's very kind. No, that's great. I will put all of those and others, and in the show notes. But yeah, Mona, thank you so much for your time today. I have really loved speaking to you. And yeah, so your book is called In My Mother's Footsteps, and it has been out for a while now. Really readily available, easy to get a hold of. So I hope a lot of people do pick it up. But honestly, thank you so much.
Thank you. You have been such a wonderful hostess and made me feel totally at ease in our conversation, and your interest and intellect and empathy were so visible to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Mona for such a deeply personal and insightful conversation. I really loved every moment of it, and I hope you did too. If you enjoyed the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the podcast.